Food safety and food technology is sometimes kind of a forgotten area of nutrition. So I want to kind of explore some areas of food safety, what you can do practically at home, how it's governed in the U.S. to keep our food system healthy. So we have a long kind of alphabet soup of all of these different agencies that monitor the health of our food system. And you're probably familiar more or less with some of these, like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, also the Environmental Protection Agency. It's going to monitor water and health in lots of areas related to the environment and agriculture. Then the USDA, and the USDA has a lot of roles to play in nutrition, and one of them is monitoring our safe food system. And really in the US, even though we hear about outbreaks, really it seems like every month, we enjoy one of the safest food supplies in the world. And this is a real benefit to us, right? Because along with food safety is that we want to regulate and reduce the opportunity for hazards related to the foods that we're consuming. So the FDA has some areas of major concern. So I'm going to kind of concentrate on what they're doing. And they're looking at different kinds of microbes or microorganisms that are related to foodborne illness. I'll talk about just a few of those later on. Also natural toxins that are in foods, and I'll give you some examples of those as well. And then residues in foods. So that could include different kinds of chemicals that are used in agriculture, like pesticides and environmental contaminants that might naturally kind of occur, or ones that are from human, different kinds of human activities. Also animal drugs. So you could think about meats and dairy products falling under that heading. The FDA is also going to look at the nutrients in food, and as more and more of our foods are processed foods, this becomes a pretty important function that they're going to play. They're going to look at food additives as well. This could be colorings, preservatives, different kinds of shelf extenders, different kinds of textural agents. Again, the goal here with the FDA is to look at these different kinds of additives and make sure that they pose no additional risk to humans. And they are also interested in the genetic modification of food. This has been something that's been going on for years. There are arguments on both sides of this, and it's a very contentious, very, very complicated argument. And you'll talk to people with very, very strong opinions about it. When we talk about that first area of the FDA concern around microbes or microorganisms, there's a huge scope of problem that we need to look at. And 76 million people have become ill within 1 year in the US from foodborne illness. But when you think about that number, it's pretty low according to some estimates, because there are a lot of people who never report foodborne illness. They might go out to eat, or they go to their church picnic and they have all kinds of gastrointestinal symptoms and they say, oh, I just have the flu. Well, those are the kind of cases that go unreported. Now, about 5,000 people a year die from foodborne illness. This is often very young and very old, and people with a compromised immune system. So the good news is that we've really made inroads in protecting people from some of the worst microorganisms. So we'll look at some of those that still cause problems in the US. So again, I kind of want to state that this is an underreported problem. So if you think you just have like stomach flu or something like that and you have no other symptoms besides gastrointestinal problems, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, chills, that kind of thing, it's likely that it could be food poisoning. So again, this goes underreported because people dismiss these symptoms as something else. So when we talk about microbes, this is going to include a couple of things that might be surprising. So we have bacteria and we have viruses and other kinds of invaders. This is really what we're talking about with foodborne illness. It's commonly called food poisoning. It's transmitted through food, through water. So you could have contaminated water that is going to make you very sick, or maybe a sandwich where the meat has not been handled properly, or contaminated rice or seafood or something else. It's caused by some kind of an infectious agent. And this can happen in a couple of different ways. It can be the agent or potentially a hazardous or poisonous substance that could be produced by bacteria or is naturally occurring in that food. And this is going to outweigh other kinds of food contamination in the US. Now, even mild foodborne illness can be potentially very, very serious. You can think about salmonella as being one that we've heard about probably a lot in the news. Also something like listeria. A pregnant woman is 40 times more likely to contract listeria poisoning, and the consequences of this can be really significant. Fetal death, fetal infection, and a whole host of other kinds of problems. So again, we might dismiss these things as, not really that much of a problem, but in someone who is particularly susceptible, if they're ill or malnourished, for instance, or their immune system may not be very strong because they're undergoing cancer treatment or they have some other kind of immune illness, they're maybe in an institutional setting. So you could think of someone who is maybe incarcerated. You could also think of people living in a dorm situation. They have different kinds of pre-existing health conditions, so maybe they have compromised liver or they have compromised digestive function. I mentioned pregnant women and then very young and very old people as well. And there are certain symptoms that we could watch for. For instance, bloody stool. That might be something that you would see with backpacker's revenge or giardia. That's a self-limiting bacteria infection that people sometimes get from drinking water when they're out camping. So it's self-limiting, but those 2 weeks are really, really unpleasant. And one of the primary things that we see is just tremendous diarrhea for those 2 weeks and then blood in the stool. So diarrhea lasting more than 3 days. Also a fever that's going to last more than 24 hours. Headaches, muscle stiffness, and so not every one of these symptoms is going to be seen with every kind of infection, but this is just a list of things that you might watch for. Numbness, muscle weakness, tingling, kind of loss of sensation or extra sensations that don't seem normal. Tachycardia, so a rapid heart rate, and you can feel this generally. Fainting or dizziness. Any of those symptoms shouldn't be ignored, and you should really contact a medical professional if they last more than a few days. So how do these microorganisms cause illness? So infection is a big part of this. So the bacteria actually gets into your body and starts to multiply and causes infection. Also intoxication, and what's happening here is that they are going to produce different kinds of chemicals. So the bacteria make a byproduct that acts as a poison, and then that interferes with other kinds of functions in your body. So like neurotoxins, we'll talk a little bit about botulism, and you're going to see that there's a toxin there that's causing the problems. Now, when we look at the food system, this is really from the farm and the producer all the way to the consumer. There's opportunities at each one of these stages for something to go wrong potentially. So on farms, you can think about the food not being washed properly. We had a case with spinach a few years ago, cantaloupe and things like that. In a processing plant, if the machinery isn't clean, there was a problem with apple juice many, many years ago, about 10 or 15 years ago, and it was kind of traced back to a processing plant. If you have a refrigerated truck that isn't kept cold and that stuff comes up to maybe a higher temperature than is optimal, bacteria starts to grow and people may not be aware. Also at the retailer, if the food is not handled properly, and you see this sometimes where there's contamination at a grocery store or other kinds of areas, and then the consumer. So if you don't cook your meat properly, you're inviting disaster really, right? And that's your responsibility, your obligation. If you choose to thaw your chicken breast on the counter and not in the refrigerator, there's so many different ways that you can actually cause food poisoning in your home. So we want to be very acutely aware of those problems. Our food system has gone global. And you can go into any grocery store and you can get food from around the world. Now, this causes some problems because you're extending this whole path of food from farm to your table. There's so many areas for it to go wrong, and the surveillance or oversight may not be optimal in every single case. So again, our food system is very safe, but we probably want to be cautious. Food that's cooked properly really poses very, very little risk. The majority of food poisoning actually occurs after purchase. So that's when we take it into our home and are preparing this food for ourselves or our family. Commercially prepared foods are generally thought of as very, very safe because these people are trained professionals. We're home cooks, we're home canners, we're having a church picnic, we're producing food where we don't normally produce food, like at a football game or a town fair or something like that. Those are all areas that might raise our level of concern to some degree. Okay, there are things that we do on every single level to prevent foodborne illness. A big one is pasteurization. Maybe you've heard of Louis Pasteur, Frenchman who is actually involved in winemaking. He really wasn't interested in dairy products when he started his experiments about how to kill bacteria. And so we use it now to heat milk, to bring it up to temperature to kill certain kinds of bacteria and make it safer for consumption. There are a couple of microbes that are responsible for the vast majority of foodborne illness. So Staphylococcus aureus is a big one. So you might have heard about this in the news in some cases. We also have Clostridium botulinum, so botulism, another big player, especially on farms. And this one produces toxins under certain conditions. So people that are working with agriculture might be at a greater risk. So we just have to take a lot of care, and normal precautions should be sufficient. And with botulism, the chances that you would ever contract this are very, very slim, but the consequences can be really significant. So we're going to talk about botulism in regard to honey and why we don't give honey to infants under 1 year of age. If we heat these different kinds of products, it's actually going to kill that toxin that does us harm. So the risk is minimized if we actually treat foods in our home with a higher degree of care. I want to also kind of look at E. coli. You've probably heard of this one. And there have been a couple of different outbreaks in the US, and this is one that leads to death, with some regularity when there's an outbreak, and hundreds of people can get very, very sick. This particular case that from the 1990s had to do with fast food and meat that was being undercooked. If the meat had been cooked properly, the risk would have been negligible. So again, meat thermometer, measuring our food temperature can be really important. We have different strains of E. coli. So this one in particular, this O157H7, is particularly deadly, and it causes just terrible, terrible symptoms. We have actually seen the emergence of these kind of foodborne illness superbugs that may not respond to antibiotic treatment in the US, and these are a huge concern in food safety circles. This all kind of leads us to what you can do. So I want you to protect yourself. So when you're shopping, you want to look at packages. You want to make sure that they're sealed well. There's very, very little tampering of food, but if a package has been opened and it's exposed to air, that can lead to the growth of bacteria. If it hasn't been handled well in terms of temperature, that could lead to different kinds of problems with bacterial growth. So, any kind of can or jar that the seal is not firmly in place is not one that you should purchase or use. So if you have something in your cupboard that's been there for many years and it looks a little suspect, just throw it out. Kind of do yourself that favor. Anything that's badly dented, now a little dent in a can of beans, that's not really what I'm talking about, something more significant. So a small dent in a can is really not that big of a problem, but if it's a larger dent, sometimes you won't be aware that actually the can has become unsealed and that air has gotten in and is spoiling the food. Frozen foods can be particularly problematic, so we want to make sure that they're kept frozen, that we don't refreeze them either. So with microwave foods, for instance, they tell you not to thaw them before you heat them in the microwave. So follow the directions on the packages, and that's going to save you a lot of trouble in the long run. Now, there are some myths that we're dealing with in food safety, and I love this one. If it tastes okay, it's safe to eat. Well, not really. So if in doubt, throw it out. We also see that people say, well, I've always thawed my meat on the counter and nobody's ever gotten sick. Well, are you sure about that? Because if we aren't very good at recognizing foodborne illness and actually saying this is what's causing people to get sick, then we don't know if those habits that we have in the kitchen are actually safe or not. We also have this one. I sampled it a couple hours ago and I didn't get sick, so it's safe to eat. Well, foodborne illness takes time to kind of incubate. So you could eat a food and you're not going to see symptoms until maybe 24 or 48 hours later, some cases 12 hours, but it's not just a few hours later. I think of the example of my aunt at the Michigan State Fair who went and had a chicken sandwich and she said, oh my God, this is so good, and she went back and got another. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks with extreme salmonella poisoning. and the sandwich didn't taste bad. You know, everybody was eating this. It was a huge problem. So you don't know just by tasting it. Now, there are things we can do in the kitchen, right? So there are different steps we can take. So cleaning, we want to separate, and we want to chill, and we want to cook. All right, that's kind of our watchwords. So bacteria, in order to grow, has to have optimal temperatures. So they really like to grow in this kind of middle range of warm. So if a food should be hot, it should be hot. You know, you want to bring things to a boil. Moisture can be your enemy. So you want to really control moisture. You don't want things soaking in water, for instance. And then it requires nutrients, right? So if you have mixed mayonnaise into your tuna or egg salad, that becomes kind of this energy the bacteria needs to grow. We also know how to defeat bacteria. So again, keeping those hot foods hot, keeping cold foods cold, and keeping raw foods separate, right? So that might be a different cutting board, washing your hands, a different knife, wiping down the counter, washing your sink, believe it or not. A lot of people miss that step. If they've rinsed chicken or opened a package in the sink, you want to wash that sink with soap and water. So a few more things that we could do to keep these raw foods separate is avoiding cross-contamination. This really happens a lot with hands or towels. You know, for instance, people will wipe their hands on a towel and they won't actually wash them. So take the time, just soap and water is all you need. You also want to keep juices away from ready-to-eat foods. So if you've ever noticed in like a commercial kitchen, if you've been in a restaurant, they always store raw meat on the lowest level. They don't store it up at the top, and you shouldn't either. Because if it drips somehow, you want it to actually be on the lowest level and not contaminate all the other foods. And again, I can't say this enough, you know, washing your hands. Soap and water, using antibacterial soaps is not necessary. Naturally, soap contains something called a surfactant, which will actually kill the bacteria. So just the act of washing your hands. Some people like to use those hand sanitizers, and that could be an extra level of cleanliness, but it doesn't substitute for actually hand washing, which is kind of the gold standard. Microbes like to be in sneaky places, okay? So we can think about our hands. Maybe that's not too sneaky. Underneath rings can be a little bit sneaky, but they also like to be in different tools that we use in the kitchen, like a sink sponge. So if you're somebody that washes the dishes with a sponge, there are different ways that you could actually clean that. Some people advocate microwaving or bleaching every day, just with like a mild bleach solution. Again, antibacterial products aren't necessary. There are benefits that we see with chlorine bleach, but there are also some negatives, right? Some people are going to have irritation to their hands, so again, a very, very weak solution is probably appropriate. It can ruin clothing, and it also becomes an environmental contaminant. So we want to use it with some caution. If I'm just cutting up maybe a cantaloupe, I'm probably not going to use bleach. But if I was cutting up a whole bunch of chicken or something like that, I might actually get out the bleach and make myself a little solution to wash down the counters when I'm done handling that. Some foods are more prone to cause problems than others. And you've probably heard this, right? There are some foods that can be problematic, so we want to kind of watch those. There are any foods that are high in moisture and high in nutrients. So for instance, a saltine cracker, relatively low risk, right? Maybe dairy products and wet cheeses and meats and cut fruits, a little bit more risk. Things that are chopped or ground. So a steak actually has less risk of foodborne illness than ground beef, right? And especially ground beef in the US. It's not coming from one cow, it's coming generally from many, many cows. So if one of those is infected, it kind of moves throughout that entire grinding process. Meats and poultry are probably one of the things people think of most often, and these require some special handling. So you want to read labels and follow advice. So at Thanksgiving, if you are tempted to thaw that turkey on the counter, it's going to tell you right on the label, don't do that. Thaw it in the refrigerator on a lowest level with some kind of a container under it to catch any kind of juices. You want to make sure that all of those meats that you're purchasing are stored in the grocery store cooler and they're in a cool environment that's going to inhibit bacterial growth. I mentioned that ground meat is particularly problematic, and I use the example of beef. And beef isn't any more special than ground turkey or ground lamb or pork or any other kind of meat. So grinding the meat exposes more surface area that can lead to bacterial growth. And you want to cook this meat until well done. That's really pretty easy to do, but then we also want to measure it with a meat thermometer. And again, these are really inexpensive tools that every home cook should have. Using the test of, feeling the meat itself and determining its doneness isn't really appropriate, and it's not going to really tell you about the internal temperature of that hamburger or steak. You want to make sure that you are cleaning up throughout this process. So if you have the burgers and you're going to take them out to the grill, you want to take them out on one dish and put the cooked burgers on a different dish to bring back into the kitchen. And again, one more comment about grilling is that the outside of the meat tends to get done more quickly than the interior. So again, the meat thermometer is going to be your friend. Let's talk about eggs. Again, very often people will say, well, eggs, salmonella, I totally see where this is a product that could cause problems. So raw, unpasteurized eggs, are going to increase your risk of contracting foodborne illness. And salmonella is really particularly a nasty bug to get. So the risk might be low, but the consequences of actually contracting that illness can be pretty significant. There are different kinds of ways to handle eggs. So if you kind of travel worldwide, you'll see that in Europe they are not refrigerated. In the US they are. And it has to do with how eggs are handled before they come to market. In the US, you need to really keep those eggs refrigerated. And it has to do with the way they're handled in that process, and they're washed and things can move inside of the egg. You want to cook them until the yolks are firm, and I know that's going to disappoint some people. You don't want it to be really runny, and you don't want to have raw eggs. Don't put them in like your nutrition shakes or your fitness shakes or anything like that. Some recipes may call for raw eggs, and in that case you can actually get egg substitutes that would be just as nutritious and would pose very, very little risk. There is sometimes a little bit of bacterial contamination that kind of escapes the pasteurization process, but the chances that that little tiny amount is going to cause problems for someone who is kind of overall healthy is really quite slim. Now, a few years ago there was an outbreak with cantaloupes. Maybe you remember that. And the problem with the cantaloupe really stemmed from that netting. You can kind of think of that rough exterior that a melon has, and it provides this really nice home for microbes. So if you are bringing home a cantaloupe, the best thing to do is to wash the exterior of that melon before you cut into it. Because the inside of the melon may not be contaminated, but when you send a knife through it, you actually distribute that microorganism throughout the meat of the fruit, and that's where the problems come into play. So all the produce that you bring home should be washed, right? Whether it's greens or melons. Some people advocate even washing off citrus fruit. So again, it's a good habit to get into, and encourage this in your home. Any kinds of unpasteurized juices can be really problematic. It was probably about 20 years ago that Odwalla juices actually had an outbreak that killed several people, and it had to do with unpasteurized fruit juice. So in your home, if you want to juice something, that's very, very different than these large-scale operations producing these juices. Raw produce. I mentioned that we should wash all the produce that we bring home, and this can be responsible for a lot more food poisoning than you would think, especially in sprouts. Maybe you remember that outbreak, and also the one with spinach. And they can be really problematic because they're consumed raw. We don't very often cook alfalfa sprouts. I don't know anybody who does that. We use fresh greens in our salads, and we don't have the opportunity to actually kill the bacteria by heating it and destroying it that way. I've got here a slide with all different kinds of things that you can do for cleaning fresh fruits and vegetables, and then also juice safety. And it can be as simple as making sure it's chilled, making sure that you dry off fruits and vegetables after you've washed them, and cutting away any bruised or damaged or opened up areas. So for instance, with apples, sometimes the stem of one apple will bump into another and cause a little hole. I would probably trim that out after I washed off the apple really well. So I mentioned sprouts and salads and things like that, and that can be an area really that we don't know how to deal with yet, because sprouts are a very specific case, and they can harbor particularly nasty E. coli bacteria, and rinsing the sprouts doesn't seem to do anything to destroy that potential for contamination. So I would just say probably caution for commercially produced sprouts of any kind. Seafood. Now this is This is going to make some people probably kind of unhappy, especially if you're a sushi lover, right? So there are all kinds of potential problems with raw or undercooked seafood. So hepatitis, different kinds of aquatic worms and flukes and other kinds of parasites. And if you think this doesn't happen, you'd be wrong. I recently had a friend who bought a piece of fish from a large supermarket chain and found 2 parasites in it that were still alive. So again, this happens. If it was completely cooked, that fish would have posed no hazard to my friend. But, you know, it's a problem we're confronting, and people don't always cook fish according to directions. There are other viruses that can be involved with seafood and naturally occurring toxins. And these dangers have increased recently, because you might think to yourself, well, people have eaten sushi for generations. People have eaten fresh conch in the Caribbean for generation after generation. But the problem is that we are really changing seafood in a lot of ways through environmental contamination and then population density, and it really is becoming this constellation of problems. So there are viruses, you know, from human diseases that are detected in our seafood and in our waters offshore. We do have monitoring agents that kind of police this, but the problem is that unhealthy food still makes its way to market. People still hunt or fish on their own and, you know, bring this kind of food home. So freezing fish is going to be somewhat effective. It can kill certain kinds of parasitic worms, but it's not going to take care of the problem entirely. So I know that there are some different kinds of measures looking at how to make seafood safer, and it involves different kinds of freezing at different temperatures. But again, it's going to involve cooking as well when that consumer brings it home. Raw oysters and raw seafood can present a whole host of problems. And I'll hear people say, well, I've got a cure for that. I'm going to have an alcoholic beverage along with my sushi. Well, that doesn't work. Hot sauce and wasabi, that doesn't work either. Okay, so again, it should really be cooked, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. And there's also environmental contamination. This happens in a lot of different ways. It can be viruses. It can also be toxins that are in that. So my bottom line here is that I would really recommend avoiding sushi and any kind of raw meat. So steak tartare, which is just fresh ground beef, I would avoid that. Raw fish, raw oysters, any of that. Now, not all types of sushi are made from raw fish. There are other things that you could enjoy if you like sushi and you like the culture around it that would be much safer choices. Now for something sweet, let's talk about honey. I mentioned earlier that we have a risk of botulism with honey because that honey is actually going to harbor the botulism spores and the toxin. So our line here is that it's not appropriate for an infant under 1 year of age. Now, a fully grown adult, that risk is negligible. We don't really have to worry about it. And even a child that's fairly young, you can feed them honey with confidence. But an infant who under 1 year does not have the resources to kind of fight off that potential threat. Now, we talked about foods that cause problems. Let's talk about venues that cause problems. So picnics, bag lunches, and takeout foods. So if these different kinds of foods in these environments are kept safe and chilled, no problem. But they're often, you know, without refrigeration. So if you're bringing a tuna fish sandwich or you have egg salad sandwich or something like that, make sure that you keep it in the refrigerator. If you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, probably fine, right? You can just put it in your backpack. We also want to be careful that if things are outside of a cooler for very long, people have the right idea bringing the cooler to the park for their picnic, but then they set food out for people to enjoy, and then they put it back in the cooler. When in doubt, throw it out. If it's been at room temperature, you need to throw it out. So a couple more things that you could do with your lunch is you could make sure that it's chilled, and you could freeze beverages to keep the entire bag cool. You could use a thermos bag. Any of these prepackaged single-serving lunch items, they keep pretty well. They have a long shelf life, but they're not necessarily good nutrition. They tend to be high in sodium and saturated fat. And there's also a lot of excessive packaging, and they tend to be costly. So they aren't necessarily a good alternative for children 5 days a week at school. Americans love takeout food. The average American eats out 3 to 5 times a week. So we need to kind of exercise some caution here. We need to make sure that those foods are safe when we buy them. We also want to handle leftovers with some caution. So we want to have things that we can reheat. So if you have leftover Chinese food, you want to make sure that you bring that up to temperature in the microwave, which is really convenient, or on the stove top. And you want to discard any of that food that has been at room temperature more than 2 hours, okay? Even if it's something like pizza, probably just throw it out if it's in doubt. And we hate to waste food, but being sick is a whole lot more problematic.